How are you? Hey guys, how is everyone? It has been Bell's Corona. Yeah, we pray that it will be eradicated soon. Yes, my name is Mushidika Maybin, public health nurse student. In today's lesson, we are going to be looking at learning, which is a topic found in psychology. So we are going to have our objectives that we are going to be looking at. The first objective is the definition. So we are going to go to the definition. First and foremost, let's look or rather take a look at the introduction, what it says. So the introduction, it is saying most of what we do or do not do is influenced by what we learn and how we have learned it. Okay, that's interesting. We are going to go direct to our definition of learning. So learning can be defined as a relative permanent change in behavior which takes place in different settings, and it is a continuous process. So the other definition is the process by which behavior is originated or changes through practice or training. Our key word in the definition of learning is process. A process can be defined as an ingoing thing that occurs to something or someone. So here in our definition, it is telling us to say learning can happen at any given point or at any given time or at any given age. That's why learning, it is a continuous process. I'll give an example. Many are the times we see people who are older than a lot of school-going children. They are old, but they go to school. And at the later stage, they pass and they become successive. So what we are trying to say is learning can happen to anyone, to any individual. Learning does not come to an end. It can happen at any given point or any given stage or age. So this is the definition of learning. From here we are going to go to our second objective, which is no other than forms of learning. What do we mean when we say forms of learning? So forms of learning, we are basically talking about what are some of the things that can make learning to be inculcated or learning to be inculcated in someone. What are some of the ways in which we can use to make sure that information or data is grasped by an individual or anything? We're going to look at the forms of learning. First, we're going to list them. The first one is conditioning. The second one is trial and error. The third one is cognitive. The fourth one is modeling. The fifth one is observation. So we are going to look at conditioning as our first form of learning in details. So here it is saying this is a form of learning that involves forming of associations between two events by repeatedly having them occur together. Classical conditioning is also referred to as associative or connective learning. Conditioning is establishing a response where one does not exist. So that's a one-word answer. So they can ask you to say, what is the other name for classical conditioning? It is also known as associative learning or connective learning. Are we together? It is also saying conditioning can be used to treat individuals with behavioral disorders. What they mean is people who've got cognitive disorders. What I mean cognitive disorders is mind disorders. E.g., an individual who smokes excessively, expresses desire to stop, can be helped by the principle of forming associations. A cigarette can be given to the smoker, and an electric shock is used every time a cigarette is given. Remember, conditioning is forming how many events? 2 events, so that they can occur together to facilitate learning. In this example, we are saying an individual who is addicted to smoking can be helped by this same form of learning by forming how many events? 2 events. In this case, we can give that individual a cigarette and an electrical shock. Another example is a child who bedwets. Every time this child bedwets, what do? We whip this child. Every time this child bedwets, we whip this child. So in this case, we are associating how many events? 2 events, the urinating event and the whipping event. In this case, we are inculcating something in the child. Later on, the child will learn to say, every time I urinate on the bed, what will happen to me? I'll be beaten. So in that case, learning is facilitated using conditioning. Are we together? Here it is also saying pairing cigarette smoking and electric shock will result in forming associations. Even when a cigarette is given without introducing an electric shock, a smoker will feel as though electric shock will accompany and will quit smoking. So this smoker, even the time we stop using this conditioning, because we've conditioned to the smoker to say every time this smoker smokes, you will think of the electric shock. Hence, learning has been facilitated, and what will happen to the smoker? He will quit smoking because he has been inculcated with the learning to say every time this smoker smokes, a shock will be introduced to this smoker. We are going to go to our second objective, which is trial and error learning. Trial and error learning was discovered by a man known as Thorndike. Thorndike was an American psychologist who invented the learning, or rather the form of learning, which is trial and error. They are saying Thorndike, an American psychologist, investigated the learning that takes place through trial and error by placing rats in a cage. We are going to look at this good example that they've given when we reach on our fourth objective, which will be the theories of learning. We are going to look at it. So this is the form of learning occurs in a situation where an individual initially does not know what is to be done to perform a certain task. A person will, for example, try to operate a given gadget by trying different methods. Try and error. Try and error, we are saying this is a form of learning where learning takes place by trying and making errors. An example given, a new gadget, maybe a phone has been bought. What will happen? Try and error will be the first form of learning that we put in place. will find that, oh, when you press this button, it will be menu. When you press this button, it will be dialing or calling somebody. In that way, we call it trial and error. And another example given, in most cases, we find that in households, mostly people who knows a lot of things when it comes to technology are children, because children, they are very good at trying and erroring. They try and they error. Are we together? So here we are saying a rat placed in a shut cage moves around aimlessly, touching and pressing parts of the cage and repeating some of the action until it hits on the right lever method of unfastening the door and manages to get out of the cage. If returned to the cage, the whole performance is repeated. A slight shorter time is taken to find its way out. One, they operate aimlessly until they chance. So they were just trying to give us a glimpse on how this type of learning occurs. They are saying a rat is placed in a cage aimlessly, it is just moving about that. It is just moving around that cage aimlessly, but by trying and erroring, it presses on the lever, which is a switch button, and the cage opens and the rat goes out. That is just trying and erroring. The rat didn't know that there is such a thing can happen. Same applies to everything that happens in this kind of learning, which is trial and error form of learning. Here it is also saying trial and error is common in practical skills, e.g. a number of things that we learn in operating a computer may be through trial and error. Just an example that I gave earlier on, you've bought a new gadget, you don't know how to operate it. What do? You trial and error. In the process, you are being inculcated with the knowledge. Are we together? We also have cognitive learning. Cognitive learning, this is the form of learning that is used to inculcate knowledge. So, cognitive learning, it is our third form of learning. It is saying it is complex and emphasizes the use of thought processes in learning. The word cognitive means knowledge use. This is far more than just stimulus and response or imitation. Cognitive learning was founded by a man known as Jean Piaget. So he said this type of learning involves knowledge or the mind, or it is a complex type of learning. It cannot occur to anyone. No, it is selective. What do I mean to say it is selective? What I mean is it involves thinking. It involves somebody to think. For example, this learning occurs to people who are critical thinkers most of the times. I'll give an example of people who took PUAS, additional mathematics. Those people were using this form of learning because such complex subjects like pure mathematics involves the complex thinking. So those people were using this type of learning, which is cognitive, using their knowledge to acquire something or to learn something. So here it is also saying when using this cognitive approach, an individual is able to learn very complex things that cannot just be learned by conditioning. No. So this type of learning is special. It is selective. It occurs to people who are critical thinkers, who think, people who've got that capacity to think in a complex way. So it is not just an ordinary learning. We're going to go to our fourth objective, which is modeling. Modeling, this is a form of learning that is done by imitating that what others are doing. The person who is being imitated may be a role model in the society or an expert in a given field. There is a lot of modeling taking place in our lives, and sometimes without or awareness, and is not planned. Teachers and parents are role models and have influenced over the students. It is important that one has a right model. So modeling is also one of the forms of learning, which is the fourth one. Here it is saying modeling involves imitation. Most of the times, if we've been asked who is your role model, we always say my role model is my mother. Some say my role model is maybe somebody who is good at music. My role model is somebody maybe who preaches such. So this form of learning involves imitating your role model. You'll find, in most cases, you find somebody who has got a role model, and then you'll be like, oh, this person, he or she behaves just like that one, because they are imitating whatever their models are doing. Are we together? Yes. Observation is our last form of learning. Observation is our last form of learning. We are saying human beings can learn by simply seeing what others are doing. Student nurses can learn by observing what senior nurses are doing. However, just observing cannot make a student competent. He has to get involved and do the actual procedure. So, observing or observation is our last form of learning, which talks about learning using our eyes, or learning using the imperialistic method. What I mean is, imperialistic is using the sense of sight. In this case, learning can only take place when the individual observing takes interest in the redoing of the actual thing that somebody has done. For example, when we are in when we are in clinical procedures, what we do is somebody, or rather our clinical tutor, will be there doing the procedure, and at a later stage somebody will be asked to do the actual procedure. In that way, learning can take place. It is also saying, as one observes, they use their cognitive processes. Imitation is a process whereby the learner wants to produce what done by another person. Imitation is a process whereby the learner wants to reproduce what is done by the other person. What they are trying to say is, they are trying to differentiate between observing and modeling. So modeling is imitation, doing the exact thing that somebody is doing, whilst observation is using the imperialistic method to learn, which is using the eyes, observing, and at a later stage doing the actual procedure. We are done with the second objective, which is the forms of learning. We are going to be looking at the problems of learning. What we are saying is, what are some of the problems, or what are the things that hinders somebody from learning? Our first problem is dyslexia. They are saying these are functional limitation in reading. So dyslexia, when somebody doesn't know how to read, what will happen? Learning cannot take place. So those are some of the problems that are affecting learning. Dyslexia, we are saying these are functional limitation reading or difficulties in reading. We also have dysgraphia. Dysgraphia, these are difficulties with physical act of writing. Writing also, when somebody doesn't know how to write, it can affect his or her capability of learning. We also have dyscalculia or dyscalculia. What is dyscalculia? Dyscalculia, difficulties with calculations. We have people who are unable to calculate. So in that case, learning cannot take place. You find that in class, if people are good at calculation, learning can easily take place. But in this case, we've got this problem, which is dyscalculia, which means learning limitations, or rather which can lead to learning limitations. We also have language deficit, difficulties in expressing oneself verbally. Language deficit is, for example, somebody fails to express his or herself in a certain given language. Hence, learning cannot take place because there is inability to express oneself verbally. We also have auditory deficit. Auditory, it is coming from the word audio, which means sound. Deficit, so it is saying difficulties in processing information through the sense of hearing. Sound has been produced, but this individual is unable to process this kind of information. It can also lead to having difficulties in learning. We also have spatial organization. Spatial organization difficulties. These are difficulties in perceiving dimension of space. We have people who cannot tell whether this space is a triangle, this space is a rectangle. Such people are there. So this problem is associated to people unable to identify space. We also have memory deficit. Memory deficit, trouble with remembering facts or what has transpired during the learning process. Memory deficit, we also have people who've got this condition where they cannot remember what has transpired or what they've learned, and this condition we call it memory deficit. We also have attention deficit disorder. This is difficulties in concentration for extended period of time. What they mean is people who cannot concentrate for a long period of time. They've got this disorder, which is attention deficit disorder, which can lead to somebody not learning. We also have attention deficit hyper disorder or hyperactive disorder. This one can also be associated to euphoria. Euphoria, this is total excitement. So this one is saying difficulties in concentrating for extended period of time together with high level of excitability and impulsivity yes. It can also be referred to as euphoria. We've got people who are hyperactive, they cannot concentrate in class, so this is the disorder that is associated to such people. We also have social skills deficit. Social skills deficit, we are saying social stands for society. Skills, it is something that you acquire and do. Difficulties in understanding elements of social interaction. So we've got people unable to interact with others, and we say interaction, that's where we gain a lot of knowledge, and that's how we learn, through interaction. So people unable to interact, they've got this kind of disorder which is associated to such people. This disorder is known as social skills deficit. We are done with the problems that affect learning. We are going straight to the theories of learning, and this includes number one, we've got classical conditioning. Number 2, we've got operant conditioning. Number 3, we have cognitive learning. Number 4, we have social learning theory. Number 5, we have biological theory. So, you need to know the difference between the forms of learning and the theories of learning. So if you've been taught to say, explain the forms of learning, do not even hesitate by writing these theories of learning. No. So understand the forms of learning, understand the theories of learning. The first theory of learning is classical conditioning. You've seen how similar they are between this one, the forms of learning, and the theories of learning. So classical conditioning, this theory was demonstrated by a Russian physiologist by the name of Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov showed that dogs could be conditioned to salivate in response to a repeated stimulus, such as a bell if it is paired repeatedly with serving of food. So conditioning, we've already known to say conditioning is pairing of how many events? 2 events. We are saying if the conditioned stimuli is presented repeatedly without being paired with food, the strength of the response will be weakened. The food in this context is the unconditioned stimulus, and the bell is the conditioned stimuli. So let me explain about the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus. So in this case, we are saying the unconditioned stimulus is the food, and the conditioned stimulus is the bell. So Ivan Pavlov used a dog in this procedure to condition the dog. So he used how many events? He had 2 events, the bell and the food. These were the events that he used. He also had the salivating part of the dog. So what they mean is when they say unconditioned stimulus, which was the food, it means the dog can not salivate when the food alone has been brought without the ring of the bell. And the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, is where the dog can only salivate when the bell has been rung. So conditioned stimulus is the bell, unconditioned is the food. What we are saying is unconditioned stimuli, this is where the dog can not salivate without the bell. So the food in this case, it is the unconditioned stimuli. In the other case, the conditioned stimuli is the bell. This means that the dog can only salivate when the bell has been rung. So in this case, the bell is the conditioned stimulus. So without the bell, the dog cannot salivate. Without the food, but the bell is there, the dog can salivate because the dog has been conditioned to the what? To the bell. Are we together? Thank you. For the learned behavior to persist, the association should be reinforced. Human beings can learn using this theory by forming associations. This theory can be used in treating human beings with unwanted behaviors, e.g., excessive drinking. And another example is a baby or a child who is bedwetting can be conditioned or can be taught using this kind of a theory, which is classical conditioning. This man by the name of Ivan Pavlov came up with some principles that he followed, and these were the principles of classical conditioning. We have acquisition. Acquisition It is saying a neutral stimulus through association acquired ability to elicit the conditioned response. This principle, it is saying for the dog to be able to respond to this stimulus, acquisition has to be there. The dog has to acquire this kind of uh, a principle. So the first principle is acquisition. The dog has to acquire to say there is such a principle in place, which is the acquisition, or there is such a theory which has been put in place. So acquisition, it is basically acquiring. So the dog has to master, or rather acquire, what is going to be done to that dog. The second principle is extinction. If you establish a conditioned response for a long time, the conditioned response will stop or will go into extinction. What they're trying to say is extinction, it is coming from the word exit, which means the dog who